All right, so here is the concept of apportionment and redistricting. So apportionment refers to the allocation of those 435 House seats to the states. And so when you average that out, that's usually about one member for every 600,000 people in the United States. And apportionment is the process that occurs after every census, which allocates these congressional seats among the 50 states according to how the population changes. So states whose populations grow will gain seats, and states whose population has declined will lose seats. And so redistricting is the process of redrawing those election districts and redistributing the legislative representatives. So this happens every 10 years to reflect the population shifts. Okay. And this redistricting can be highly political because districts can be created and shaped to give an advantage for the majority party in the legislature who controls the redistricting process. So in 2010 we had a census, and so based on that census some states gained seats and some states lost seats. So the state of Texas gained some seats. So the state of Texas had to look at its map and think about how are we going to redraw the district to create these new districts in order to have our people represented in Congress. The group that gets to decide how the state is going to be redrawn are the state legislatures in Austin. So it's important about who controls the state legislature. Do Democrats control or do Republicans control? So whatever party controls the state legislature, they're going to take the lead and have the votes to pass a redistricting plan in order to create new seats that's going to favor the Republican and or Democratic Party. So after the redistricting in 2000, for example, both Republicans and Democrats challenged the remaps or the redistricting that they viewed as unfair in court. So the state of Texas was embroiled in a big lawsuit that dealt with redistricting, and this is why Tom DeLay was booted out of the House and why he's probably going to face some time in jail for some of this stuff that was done during the redistricting in the state of Texas. All right. Here's an example of the result of the congressional reapportionment in the year 2000. This is after back in 2000. So you can see here the state of Texas gained 2 seats. So prior to 2000, we had 30 districts, and so the whole state was carved up into 30 districts. When we gained 2 seats in 2000 for the 2002 election, the state of Texas had to redistrict, that is, redraw some districts in order to create 2 new districts. And this would mean that you had 2 new public officials running for office. All right. And again, here's the results of reapportionment and how many seats they had for that same time period. So it's just a different map showing you some different colors. The states in red lost seats. The states in dark yellow or orange gained 2 seats, and the blues had no change. So you can see people are leaving what is called the Rust Belt up here in the old manufacturing belt and moving to the Sun Belt, for example. Okay. All right. This is the 2012 electoral map after the 2010 census that we just had. So we saw where the state of Texas had gained some seats. Well, they gained even more seats. Okay, so we're now up to about 38 seats. So you can see that we had to redistrict or redraw the lines. Okay. So when it comes to apportionment, there's redistricting. But there's also the occurrence of what is called malapportionment. Anytime you see M-A-L, mal, in front of a word, that usually has something bad going on. So prior to 1962, states were notorious for malapportionment, or having districts that had grossly unequal number of people in them. So for example, a rural district in the state of Georgia had 232,000 people in that particular district, whereas Atlanta had 823,000 people. So if you look at these 2 districts in the state of Georgia, whose vote had more weight? If you lived in the rural district, your vote was worth more than the person who lived in Atlanta. This means that the votes of those living in Atlanta were comparatively diluted. your representative had to take into account the interests of all these different people compared to that person who's representing the rural districts. So the court started to take a look at this type of malapportionment. And so there were a couple of court cases. The first, and you're going to want to make note of these, the first was a case called Baker v. Carr in 1962. And this is the cartoon, this is the state of Tennessee. So this is a state case where the state legislatures were in violation of what is called the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause because the state districts were malapportioned. And so here, Baker v. Carr in 1962, the Supreme Court ruled that malapportionment in the Tennessee state legislatures violated the Constitution, specifically the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. That basically said because of malapportionment, not every citizen in the state of Texas was equally protected because they didn't have equal representation. 2 years later, in Westbury v. Sanders in 1964, the Supreme Court applied this same logic at the state level to congressional districts. So you had two court cases that are important that deal with the issue of apportionment. And both of these court cases tried to solve the problem of malapportionment. The Baker v. Carr case dealt with the state of Tennessee and said state legislative districts cannot be malapportioned. 2 years later, they applied the same logic to congressional districts and said we need one man, one vote policy basically at the congressional level so that each congressperson is representing relatively the same number of people in each district. That's why you have some districts that are geographically large, like in the state of Texas, in the Panhandle, and in West Texas, and why you have districts that are geographically small, like they are in the greater Houston area. It's based on the number of people, not the acreage. So if we base on the last census, each member of the U.S. House of Representatives represents an average population of little over 650,000 people. Okay. All right. So this has resulted in the philosophy of one man, one vote. It doesn't matter where you live geographically, your vote shouldn't count more or less than someone else's vote when it comes to congressional districts, that is the House of Representatives. Okay. We also have the issue of when you redistrict, remember the state legislature has control of the redrawing of congressional districts after each census. The concept of gerrymandering occurs when district lines are drawn for a political advantage. So by the word gerrymandering, you should write down that this occurs when district lines are drawn for a political advantage. Okay, so and we're going to break that down into partisan gerrymandering as well as racial gerrymandering. And the way you gerrymander is that you either concentrate one party's voters into a single district in order to waste their votes, or by splintering or dividing up a minority to deny representation. And I have an example of that graphically momentarily. The court has ruled that partisan gerrymandering, that is redrawing district lines based on a partisan, that is party advantage, does not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. On the other hand, racial gerrymandering, which is designed to disadvantage a particular minority, violates both the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So again, partisan gerrymandering is not unconstitutional. Racial gerrymandering is. And there are several court cases that deal with this particular issue. And Miller v. Johnson is one of those, as well as Thornburg and the Shaw case. So let me just say a few things about these court cases. Prior to 1982, redistricting was illegal if boundaries were intentionally drawn to dilute the minority influence. This is called the intent test. So again, prior to 1982, if the intent was to intentionally draw a boundary to dilute minority influence, that was going to be considered unconstitutional. After 1982, Congress passed a law outlawing any electoral arrangement that has the effect of weakening the minority voting. This is the effect test. So even if you didn't mean to redraw that provided a disadvantage to the minority, if the effect was a disadvantage, that redrawing was going to be considered unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruled in the Thornburg case in 1986 that state legislatures were to redistrict in order to what we call maximize minority representation in the states. That is, the court wanted states to redistrict in order to create what are called majority-minority districts, where you have a district where the majority in that district were made up of minorities. This has been referred to as affirmative action gerrymandering. However, in the Shaw case, the Supreme Court moved away from that idea that districts should be created based on racial composition. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote that racial gerrymandering bears an uncomfortable resemblance to political apartheid. So ultimately, the court case of Miller in 1995, the Supreme Court limited racial redistricting and stated that race cannot be the predominant factor in redrawing electoral district lines. Okay. So let me just summarize here what this means. When it comes to redistricting, it's very political, and so states want to try and make an advantage for their political party. So partisan gerrymandering is not unconstitutional. However, if the courts think that the gerrymandering is based on race in order to create a disadvantage from one race or a minority, they're going to call that unconstitutional. It doesn't matter if you intended to or if the effect was disadvantaging a minority, they're going to be considered unconstitutional. At one point, the courts in the Thornburg decision wanted to create minority districts. However, in the Shaw case, they kind of stepped back from that and said, we don't want to create districts based solely on race. And so now the decision in the Miller case says that we cannot create, race cannot be a predominant factor in redrawing electoral district lines. I have a couple of other slides that tries to summarize this that I didn't post originally in the PDFs that you probably printed out. And so I will make a note to provide these online as well. I find them helpful to try and summarize all of this. All right, so we really have three different factors going on. We have apportionment, malapportionment, and gerrymandering as you move from left to right. Apportionment is simply the idea that congressional seats are divided up amongst the states based on population. There's nothing really political about that until we get to the issue of, because of redistricting, which occurs after the census, some of those seats were malapportioned. That is to say that some representatives had greater number of constituents in their district than others. And part of this malapportionment was due in part to gerrymandering, which is the term used to describe the redrawing of district lines for some sort of political advantage. Okay. So again, the definition of apportionment, we want to, because of the census, we're going to reapportion, that is reassign how many states get how many seats, and because of that reapportionment, we have to redistrict. The Baker v. Carr case from the state of Tennessee helped the court realize that they had to legislate that state legislative districts could not be malapportioned, and the Westbury case said that congressional seats could not be malapportioned. The court has said that partisan gerrymandering is okay, but racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. From a time perspective, the Tennessee case for Baker v. Carr was 1962, and this is a little messed up, but prior to 1982, the courts looked at the intent of the law, the redistricting. Was the intent to cause a political or a racial gerrymandering? If it was going to be unconstitutional. Now they look at the effect. It doesn't matter if the intent was good or bad, it's the effect of the redistricting that matters. Then you had the Thornburg case that tried to create minority-majority districts, the Reno and Shaw case that said we don't want to create districts based solely on race, and the Miller case in 1995 that talked about race cannot be the sole factor in determining districting. All right, here is a graphical example of packing districts or splintering districts in order to deal with partisan gerrymandering. So here's a case where this region is made up of mostly Democratic voters, and this region of the district or the state is mostly Republican voters. So this would be a Republican plan, is how to get seats distributed so that we would have 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, okay, out of an area that used to be mainly 2 Democrats would win this whole area. So what we want to do is we want to lump opposition voters into one area so that we pack this area to have Democrats, and we know that this seat will be won by Republicans. Because if this was just all 1 seat, let's say it was 1 seat before, then Democrats are going to win. In a Republican plan, if we redistrict this having 3 seats, we can ensure at least 1 Republican vote here. However, if you're the Democrats, you want to ensure that there's no Republican seat. And so instead of dividing it up this way, vertically, we're going to divide the state horizontally, and here we're going to have 3 seats where the Democrat is going to win because they are dominant in this seat, they're dominant in this seat, and they're dominant in this seat. So splintering is where you splinter up a group of voters so they don't constitute a majority in any district. So this is how you can partisan gerrymander in order to ensure that you're either going to get a seat, or how, if you're the Democratic plan, how you can ensure that your Republicans don't get a seat. All right, that's just a graphic representation for you. All right, here is the definition of a majority-minority district. This is a congressional district drawn to include enough members of a minority to greatly improve the chance of electing a minority candidate. So this is where the courts decided in the Thornburg case that they wanted to create these types of districts. But remember, in the Shaw case in 1993, the Supreme Court moved away from creating such types of districts. So again, racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. All right, now that we dealt with apportionment, let's talk about Congress as a representative body when it comes to congressional burnout. Since 1996, there's been a record number of congressmen and women who have either quit or decided not to run for office, and we're seeing that a lot now as well. Many have left Congress completely bitter about the system or disenchanted about their jobs. Well, there's several reasons why they leave. First, most Congress people, believe it or not, work really exhausting days on Capitol Hill. They run from meeting to meeting. They fly home on Thursday to meet their constituents back home, trying to raise enough money for the next election cycle, and then they go back to Washington, D.C. to vote. So there's a lot of time commitment where you're flying around the country a lot. Second, most Congress people feel their work never pays off in the end. And this is because of divided government, where the White House and Congress are usually from different parties, and it leads to gridlock and partisan fighting. And this is particularly an issue today, this extreme partisanship that we have in government. Power is fragmented in Congress. The average representative is on 8 committees, so that leads to a lot of different expertise that's needed. And so a lot of times the congressperson feels that the constituents don't know enough about each one of these issues, or the party doesn't have enough information, that they really don't want to listen to their own party, and then they get in trouble in terms of party discipline. And third, public opinion, as I mentioned, is constantly showing people think Congress is overpaid, underworked, and corrupt. In 1994, as low as it is now, in 1994 the approval rating for Congress was 8%. So in that environment, why do people stay? Well, most people who are in Congress would suggest that no matter how frustrating the job can get, the fact remains that Congress is still one of the most powerful legislatures or institutions in the world. Congress is the true power of government in Washington. It lies at the heart of policy making. It has the power to raise taxes, pass laws, declare war, impeach the president. And so there's a lot of power, and a lot of people are still running for Congress for very altruistic reasons. They want to make a difference. So what are these motives for people who are in Congress? Well, there is a typology put forth by Richard Fenno, who is a political scientist, who says that the motives of Congresspeople is re-election, policy influence, and power and prestige. The number one goal of most Congresspeople is to get re-elected. And this leads to what is called the re-election imperative. It is the primary motive for why Congresspeople or what their motives are. They want to get reelected. But they also want to influence policy, and a lot of them like the power and prestige associated with the office. So what's involved in this reelection imperative? They have to get reelected for these other two things to happen. So because House members are elected every 2 years, they're constantly up for reelection. So this is why it's number one on their motivation list. In order to be able to influence policy, in order to have the power and prestige to influence policy, they have to get reelected. So there's tools that they can use to get reelected in part of their reelection imperative, and this is why it's important to be an incumbent. They can point to all the patronage that they give out, jobs, and other types of opportunities for the constituents. They can point to pork barrel legislation, all the casework they do for an individual. Members of Congress do all kinds of things through their staff, like track down late Social Security check, reports of poor VA medical treatment, expediting a visa. These are all things that are called casework that the congressperson can point to why they should get reelected. And so this implications of a reelection imperative means that there's lots of patronage going on. Members have the opportunity to provide direct benefits or patronage for their constituents through pork barrel that I've already talked about, casework, and this infamous earmarks that we hear about, where no one wants to have earmarks. But here are some examples of pork barrel. Highway bills are a favorite vehicle for pork barrel spending, and if you travel between the Woodlands or Conroe and the university, you know what this means. Lots of money is made and lots of people have jobs through highway construction. But if you push for specific projects that benefit your district, like dams, highways, academic research centers, these are known as earmarks, and this is where people are arguing that we should do away with earmarks. So, for example, Kay Granger, who was a Republican from the state of Texas, took credit for winning a $90,000 project from Congress to create a bilingual audio tour for the Cowgirl Museum in Fort Worth. Another example, $50,000 was given to research on shiitake mushrooms at the South Central Family Farm Research in Boonville, Arkansas. $400,000 to help the Nevada Wildlife Division return displaced wildlife to their natural habitats. $125,000 was given to the Texas-based Sire Power, Inc. to sell frozen bovine semen. $500,000 to the Popcorn Institute. $14,000 to High Mountain Jerky to promote beef jerky. $75,000 to the Mohair Council to advertise fabrics made of goat hair. $3 million to the California Raisin Board to run dancing raisin ads. I'm not sure if you remember the California raisins. All right, so this is all example of earmarks and pork barrel legislation that's called patronage. In 2007, however, the House passed new ethic rules requiring that those representatives supporting particular earmarks to identify themselves and guarantee that they had no personal financial stake in the requested project. Okay. So if we think about earmarks, we hear about them in today's environment with the Tea Party initiative in particular. All right. One last thing before we close this lecture is to remember that most members of Congress have a local orientation, despite the constitutional emphasis on the higher duty to the nation. So most members of Congress want to deal with local interests because this is how they get themselves reelected. But how do we view that in terms of our Congress members? Do we see Congress members as a trustee, where they use their best judgment and act for the nation as a whole? Do we see them as a delegate, where they represent the viewpoint of constituents alone and feel bound to the wishes of the majority of constituents? In reality, there is the politico, and this is the description used to describe a blend of the two views of Congress. The representative behavior changes with the particular issue. On vital district interests, the congressperson is going to act as a trustee. So if there is something that the Montgomery County or this district is really interested in, then Kevin Brady is going to act like a delegate and represent our interests, that what we want to have happen will actually happen. On other issues like world hunger, where maybe the majority of people in this particular district don't have a definitive opinion, the representative is more free to be a trustee. That is, to act on how he thinks or she thinks is in the best interest. So if there's vital interest, then the congressperson acts like a delegate. If it's other issues that don't really concern the district very much, then the congressperson is probably going to work as a trustee. So it's really a combination of the two. And of course, that leads us back to public opinion. There's really two views of Congress. As I mentioned before, the public views Congress with distrust, disapproval, but voters view their own representative as typically favorable. And that differentiates between the national interest and the district interests. And so if you think about it, Congress reflects the individualism and diversity that characterizes the United States as a nation. The strength of Congress are its capacity for deliberation, compromise, and the weighing of many interests. The weakness of Congress is its inability to address broad national issues because Congress people are generally more focused on the tendency to cater to constituent needs. All right. This ends part 1 on Congress, so make sure you review the reading questions and key terms. And again, there's practice quizzes at the Norton website as well as your chapter. The next time we'll talk about Congress as an institution and talk really about how the Congress works on a day-to-day basis. All right, we will see you back at part 2.